Everyone. My name is Ron Bernier. I'm the chair of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And on behalf of the department and the College of Arts and Sciences, I'd like to welcome everyone, particularly the first-year class, but also colleagues and other guests, at this, our 12th consecutive year of summer reading and our 8th consecutive year of tying in the author, a visiting author, with the event. Now, in the last few weeks since the semester started, most of you in your English classes have been engaged in one way or another in discussion and writing about this pretty remarkable text. This evening is your opportunity to hear from the author herself and to ask some questions. But before I introduce our guests, I'd like to acknowledge a few people who help to make this event possible every year. Foremost among them is our Summer Reading Committee, ably led by Professor Gloria Monahan. Each year, working with her fellow committee members and seeking the input of the entire Humanities and Social Sciences faculty, Professor Monahan works to select the text and the author who can bring something unique to the Wentworth student body. So thank you, Gloria, and to your team. I'd also like to acknowledge the continued support of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Pat Hafford, and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, Dr. Russ Pinizzotto. Thank you, Professors Hafford and Pinizzotto, for ensuring that this opportunity continues to be made available to an ever-growing first-year population of students. Finally, before I introduce our guests, I'd like to ask you all, out of courtesy and respect, to silence your phones and put away any other devices and distractions. I understand that we will be live tweeting this event for the first time tonight, so please use your phones only for that purpose. The hashtag is hashtag #SummerReading2014, capital S, capital R. The format tonight will be our author will read for a little bit and then open it up to questions from the audience. She really wants to hear from you. We are thrilled and honored to have with us today Cambridge-based writer Madeline Miller, author of the much acclaimed novel The Song of Achilles. Born here in Boston and raised in both New York City and Philadelphia, Miller earned her undergraduate degree in classics from Brown University, where she also went on to take her master's degree, also in classics. For the last 10 years, she's been teaching Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students. She's also studied at the Yale School of Drama, where she focused on the adaptation of classical texts to modern formats. And one of the results of that study is clearly tonight's text, The Song of Achilles, her first novel, which was awarded the prestigious Orange Prize for Fiction in 2012 and was a New York Times bestseller. To date, The Song of Achilles has been translated into 23 languages, including Dutch, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, and Greek. Reviewers have been effusive in their praise for the novel, remarking on what one writer called a combination of, quote, of scholarship and imagination, turning what we thought was a familiar epic into, quote, a fresh, emotionally riveting and sexy page-turner. This from the UK's news source, The Independent. The Washington Post has written, quote, in prose as clean and spare as the driving poetry of Homer, Miller captures the intensity and devotion of adolescent friendship and lets us believe in these long-dead boys for whom sea nymphs and centaurs are not legend but lived reality. Publishers Weekly remarked, quote, this first-time novelist masterfully brings to life an imaginative yet informed vision of ancient Greece, featuring divinely human gods and larger-than-life mortals. She breaks new ground retelling one of the world's oldest stories about men in love and war, end quote. And Finally, speaking to the fearlessness of tonight's guest, the Dallas Morning News has said, quote, "Even for a scholar of Greek literature, which Miller is, rewriting the Western world's first and greatest war novel is an awesome task to undertake. That she did it with such grace, style, and suspense is astonishing." There is plenty more praise I could cite, but I think we're all very eager to hear from the author herself. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Madeline Miller.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here and very grateful that you read my novel over the summer and have been discussing it. So thank you very much. I want to start by reading two very short sections, less than 5 minutes from the book. And then I'm really eager to hear what you all have to say. So I'll just go right into questions after that. The two sections I'm going to read are from towards the beginning of the book. The first is when the boys are 11 years old. This is after Patroclus has been exiled from his kingdom and taken in by Achilles and Achilles' father as basically a charity case. And the two boys are just beginning to become friends. And the second section, which I'll just go right into, is the first time Patroclus meets Achilles' mother, the sea nymph Thetis. Our friendship came all at once after that, like spring floods from the mountains. Before, the boys and I had imagined that his days were filled with princely instruction, statecraft and spear. But I had long since learned the truth. Other than his lyre lessons and his drills, he had no instruction. One day we might go swimming, another we might climb trees. We made up games for ourselves of racing and tumbling. We would lie on the warm sand and say, "Guess what I'm thinking about?" The falcon we had seen from our window, the boy with the crooked front tooth, dinner. And as we swam or played or talked, a feeling would come. It was almost like fear in the way it filled me, rising in my chest. It was almost like tears in how swiftly it came. But it was neither of those, buoyant where they were heavy, bright where they were dull. I had known contentment before, brief snatches of time in which I pursued solitary pleasure, skipping stones or dicing or dreaming. But in truth it had been less a presence than an absence, a laying aside of dread. My father was not near, nor boys. I was not hungry, nor tired, nor sick. This feeling was different. I found myself grinning until my cheeks hurt, my scalp prickling till I thought it might lift off my head. My tongue ran away from me, giddy with freedom. "This and this and this," I said to him. I did not have to fear that I spoke too much. I did not have to worry that I was too slender or too slow. This and this and this. I taught him how to skip stones, and he taught me how to carve wood. I could feel every nerve in my body, every brush of air against my skin. He played my mother's lyre, and I watched. When it was my turn to play, my fingers tangled in the strings, and the teacher despaired of me. I did not care. "Play again," I told him, and he played until I could barely see his fingers in the dark. I saw then how I had changed. I did not mind anymore that I lost when we raced, and I lost when we swam out to the rocks, and I lost when we tossed spears or skipped stones. For who can be ashamed to lose to such beauty? It was enough to watch him win, to see the soles of his feet flashing as they kicked up sand, or the rise and fall of his shoulders as they pulled through the salt. It was enough. So the first time Patroclus meets Thetis. The next night, when the household slept, I climbed out of our window. The moon was half full, bright enough for me to pick my way over the rocks without a torch. He had said that I was to stand in the surf, and she would come. No, he had reassured me. You do not need to speak. She will know. The waves were warm and thick with sand. I shifted, watched the small white crabs run through the surf. I was listening, thinking I might hear the splash of her feet as she approached. A breeze blew down the beach, and grateful, I closed my eyes to it. When I opened them again, she was standing before me. She was taller than I was, taller than any woman I had ever seen. Her black hair was loose down her back, and her skin shone luminous and impossibly pale, as if it drank light from the moon. She was so close I could smell her, seawater laced with dark brown honey. I did not breathe. I did not dare. You are Patroclus. I flinched at the sound of her voice, hoarse and rasping. I had expected chimes, not the grinding of rocks over the surf. Yes, lady. Distaste ran over her face. Her eyes were not like a human's. They were black to their center and flecked with gold. I could not bring myself to meet them. He will be a god, she said. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. She leaned forward, and I half thought she might touch me, but of course she did not. Do you understand? I could feel her breath on my cheek, not warm at all, but chilled like the depths of the sea. Do you understand? He had told me, too, that she hated to be kept waiting. Yes. She leaned closer still, looming over me. Her mouth was a gash of red, like the torn open stomach of a sacrifice, bloody and oracular. Behind it, her teeth shone sharp and white as bone. Good. Carelessly, as if to herself, she added, You will be dead soon enough. She turned and dove into the sea, leaving no ripples behind her. So I would really love to hear from you all. I want to make sure that whatever I'm talking about today are things that you're actually interested in hearing about. So please, any question, nothing is off the table. Anything you want to ask about writing, about this book in particular, about the publishing process, I'm happy to try and answer. So I think there's going to be a microphone here if people want to.
Raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll come over to you. Stand up. It's okay. Come right in the middle. Okay. And just talk.
Why did you kill Achilles in a different way than is commonly known in the myth?
That's a great question. So one of the things about any time you're dealing with these ancient myths is there were so many different versions of them, particularly the most famous, most popular characters, Achilles, Odysseus. All the ancient authors wanted to kind of write their own version of it. So there are many, many different versions. And it just so happens that the most famous version that has come down to us, the story of Achilles and his, famously vulnerable heel, is actually a very, very late version. Homer was composing his poem somewhere around 750 or 700 BC. And the version that we have of the heel story, which now is the most famous story, is actually from Roman times, over 500 years later. So it's not in the original version that Homer writes. In Homer's presentation of Achilles, Achilles is just, this incredibly powerful warrior, incredibly fast, and people are sort of afraid of him, but he doesn't have any of that whole story about, his mother holding him by the heel, dipping him in the river, all that stuff, all that came much later, as other authors decided to tell their own versions of the story, and one of those caught on, and it happens to be what we talk about today is the most popular version, but in the ancient world it wasn't the most popular version. So what I wanted to do was I really wanted to go back to those earliest stories. My primary inspiration in writing this was Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, and so since it wasn't in Homer, I excluded it.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Can you stand up? Do you mind? Come over here. We can't get over to you. Ask a question. Come right out here. Awesome. Oh, talk loud, okay? Talk loud, nice and loud.
There were clearly a lot of different things included in your novel, things like romance, all sorts of different characters, war, and a historical aspect. Were there any part of that seemed difficult or easy, more difficult or simpler than you expected to incorporate into an entire story?
I think actually one of the things that I found most challenging to incorporate were the scenes that actually are in the Iliad. The Iliad itself, Homer's epic poem about the Trojan War, covers a very short period of time. The war is 10 years long, but the Iliad itself just covers this period in the last year of the war, starting with the argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, where Achilles refuses to fight anymore, and ending with Hector's death. So the Iliad itself doesn't cover Achilles' death at all. It doesn't cover the Trojan horse. It doesn't cover the fall of Troy. None of that stuff. It really is just this very short period. And it's a poem that I had studied both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. I had written a lot of papers about it. I had incorporated it into my thesis. And so it was a poem I knew really well. And when it came time for my story to kind of catch up with the Iliad, right around that first huge argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, sometimes it was difficult how well I knew the Iliad to find my own way to the story. For example, the insults that Achilles and Agamemnon sling at each other in that first gigantic fight that they have at Troy, they don't translate real well into modern English. Things like, you know, sack of wine, dog face, they just don't have good punch in the same way. But I had those in my head because I've read them a lot of times, and so it was a matter of kind of finding my way through, being able to shut out Homer a little bit and find my own way. You specifically mentioned the romance also, so I wanted to address that. One of the interesting things about Achilles and Patroclus and how their relationship has been interpreted over the years is that this is a big subject of debate, both today and in the ancient world. That the ancient authors were constantly going back and forth, you know, were they or weren't they? Were they together or were they not together? And a lot of ancient authors said yes. For example, Plato. We have Plato talking about Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. And we have a fragment of a tragedy written by the playwright Aeschylus, where he talks about, it's Achilles mourning over Patroclus's body and talking about their frequent kisses when Patroclus was alive. So clearly Aeschylus was taking them as lovers in that tragedy. So when it came to the romance, even though I was imagining it myself through the eyes of Patroclus, I actually was on pretty solid ground historically, because that was one of the traditions that had been very popular in the ancient world. So I sort of felt like I was working within a framework for that. I wasn't just kind of out in left field.
Other questions for our author? I'm going to move down here. Yes, okay. You can stand up.
Why did you choose to write the book through the eyes of Patroclus and not
I find Patroclus a really fascinating figure. If any of you have read the Iliad, what you'll see is that Patroclus is a really minor character in the Iliad. He barely shows up at all. You know, if we were going to cast a play or a movie of the Iliad, Patroclus's name would be like way down in the credits because he doesn't have very much screen time. He's always there in the background with Achilles. Whenever Achilles is there, Patroclus is in the background, but he doesn't really talk or do anything until that moment where he puts on Achilles' armor and goes into battle. And then we suddenly get to see a little bit of his personality. But pretty much right after that happens, spoiler, he's killed. So you don't really get to, you know, see very much of him other than that. What you really get to see with Achilles, with Patroclus, is Achilles' reaction to his death. So Patroclus is he's kind of a mystery character because Achilles' reaction to losing him is overwhelming. It is completely obliterating. It is like nothing else in the rest of the Iliad. And the Iliad, let me tell you, is a poem that is filled with death and grief. There are whole books of this poem that are just, and then this guy stabbed this guy, and then he stabbed this guy, and then he put his spear through the brains and they came out the back of his head, and then his teeth exploded out of his mouth, and then his spleen ruptured. I mean, really, line after line after line of that. And when you're studying the Iliad in Greek, you learn all the names for the internal organs because there's so much death and exploding and blood and guts. So this is a poem that is filled with death. And it's filled with people reacting to death, with mothers who've lost their sons or their husbands, sisters who've lost their brothers, just over and over again. But Achilles' grief for losing Patroclus is really, even within that context, it jumps out at you. It's overwhelming. It's completely overwhelming. And so what I wanted to do in exploring the character of Patroclus is I was really drawn into this mystery. Why? This guy has barely any screen time. He's barely in the poem. And yet, when he dies, he explodes Achilles' life. Why? So I started exploring the poem. I started going deeper and trying to find every single instance where Patroclus is mentioned and sort of what is it about him that makes him interesting? Why does Achilles love him so much? Why does he matter? And I found some really curious things about the character, some things that really set him apart from ancient heroes. For one thing, he has this tragic backstory where when he was a boy, he murders another boy accidentally. Or he accidentally kills him at this game, you know, at a game of dice, which I incorporated into the book, but that's mentioned in the Iliad. So that's interesting. He has a tragic backstory. He was a prince, but then he was exiled. And then you also have this thing where Achilles is not the only person who mourns for Patroclus' death. He's also mourned for by Briseis, who is the slave woman who's given to Achilles by Agamemnon and kind of is the point of, you know, argument between Achilles and Agamemnon. And Briseis delivers in the Iliad a beautiful speech over Patroclus' body where she says of Patroclus, "You were always kind." And that really jumped out at me because if you know anything about the ancient mythology, you know kindness is not a word that gets thrown around a lot when you're talking about ancient heroes. You were always kind, you were always gentle, is sort of the word she uses. So that really jumped out at me also. And Menelaus, the great king of the Greeks who was married to Helen, he sort of is kind of the reason that the war was starting, he also says of Patroclus, he was kind to everyone. Again, very unusual. So I thought, well, here's this Greek hero who is sort of standing outside a lot of the ways other Greek heroes behave in the Iliad, and he matters to Achilles. So that was really why I wanted Patroclus as my narrator. I thought he was a really intriguing figure, and I wanted to sort of get to the bottom of the mystery around him.
Other questions? Yes, come on out here.
Well, obviously there's a big focus in the romance between Achilles and Patroclus. I just wanted to know, why did you decide to expand so much on the romance instead of the blood, guts, and gore of the story of the Iliad?
So I've talked about how overwhelming Achilles' grief is for losing Patroclus in the Iliad, that in that moment of discovering that Patroclus is dead, his first thought is actually to kill himself. But the other Greeks prevent him. And up until then, Achilles has been saying, nothing will make me fight, nothing will make me fight for Agamemnon again, there's no way I'm going to fight. And then as soon as he finds out Patroclus is dead, he's running back into battle to kill Hector. All that is forgotten and gone. So some of what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell a story that I felt like was worthy of Achilles' reaction in that moment. I sort of set that moment on my horizon and wrote towards it. That if that is, if Patroclus is so much of Achilles' life, that that's his reaction to losing him, then I need to tell a story that creates a relationship that can lead to that type of grief and that moment. So I think that's why I focused so much on it, is because I actually felt like that love story is already kind of present in the Iliad. It's just Homer doesn't really get into it. So I kind of wanted to tell the backstory to that, to how we get to that terrible moment when Achilles, learns Patroclus is dead and wants to kill himself. I felt like it was already part of the story, just not expanded upon.